The Ozark Mountains in the final years of the 19th century were a place the world seemed to have forgotten. The forests were thick, their branches knitted so tightly that sunlight slipped through only in broken streams. Mist often rolled down from the peaks, soft and white like breath from the earth itself. Life here was quiet, too quiet, some would say, and that quietness made it easy for things to disappear. People too. In the winter of 1899, whispers started drifting through small mountain towns like Leadwood and Crawford Hollow, 28 men gone without a trace. Some said they'd run off chasing gold rumors, others that they'd been swallowed by the forest. But a few, the ones who lived close enough to hear the strange screams echoing through the trees at night, said something else entirely. Before any of that came to light, before the fear took hold, the world of the Ozarks seemed simple. People worked hard, prayed harder, and trusted in the rhythm of the land. Farms sat scattered over hills like faded postcards, with smoke curling from chimneys and dogs sleeping under broken porches. Neighbors helped neighbors because no one else would. The nearest sheriff's station was a ride through mud and rock. News traveled slower than sickness. You learned to depend on the faces you saw, even when you didn't trust them. The sisters were already a quiet legend by then, 3 women who lived on the edge of the ridge near Devil's Hollow, in a sagging farmhouse that had stood empty for a decade before they moved in. Their names were Clara, Ruth, and Maybelle, though people rarely used them. To most, they were simply the Ozark sisters. No one knew much about where they'd come from. Some said Tennessee, others whispered they were runaways from a religious commune. They were pale, polite, and oddly calm, always speaking in low voices as if afraid of being overheard by something hiding in the woods. At first, the sisters blended in. They kept to themselves but traded eggs and herbs in town. Clara, the eldest, was the talker. She had a steady look that made men pause mid-sentence. Ruth handled the money, her face unreadable, eyes dull as river stones. Maybelle was the youngest and the quietest, barely 20, with skin so fair it almost glowed in the candlelight. People said she could charm any man who looked at her for too long, though no one could say exactly why. The men in town noticed them before the women did. It started with harmless talk, curiosity about the new neighbors, speculation about their past, about why 3 young women would live alone in a place known for wolves and worse. Then came the visits. A broken fence that needed mending, a wagon wheel stuck in the mud near their land. The sisters always thanked them kindly, always offered supper or cider. No one ever spoke badly of those visits, but some of the men didn't come back. In those early weeks before suspicion took root, people thought life was normal. Church bells still rang on Sundays. The tavern filled with laughter and boots clattering on wood floors. Children played near the stream collecting frog spawn and skipping rocks. The forest loomed beyond it all, dark and endless like a living thing watching over the town. Everyone depended on it for hunting, wood, and sometimes for hiding secrets. But something felt different that winter. The animals grew restless. Dogs barked at nothing in the night. Livestock turned up dead, their bodies untouched except for strange marks along their necks, as though something had drained them dry. A few old hunters swore they saw figures moving through the fog, tall, thin shapes walking in pairs. Most brushed it off as superstition. After all, the Ozarks had always been a place where the line between the living and the dead seemed thinner than it should be. The missing men were first noticed in November. One was a trapper, another a traveling salesman. Then a blacksmith's apprentice vanished after saying he'd take firewood up to the ridge for the sisters. His mother swore she saw his coat hanging on their porch the next day, but when she returned with help, it was gone. No one accused the sisters outright, not then. They were women, and the idea that they could be dangerous didn't fit the world people thought they lived in. But unease spread quietly. Conversations grew shorter when their names came up. Doors were locked earlier. Lanterns burned later into the night. It was as if everyone could feel something waiting just beyond their reach, something patient, watching, choosing. If you stood near the ridge at sunset, you could hear faint sounds drifting from the sisters' land. A rhythmic clanging, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. No one wanted to be the one to find out which. Those who worked the nearby fields said they'd seen lights flickering under the ground, like fire trapped in glass. But when they told the sheriff, he only laughed and said folks had too much imagination for their own good. Still, in small places like that, truth always leaks out through gossip. Someone claimed Clara had once been married, that her husband died under strange circumstances. Another swore Ruth had been seen buying chains from a peddler passing through. And Maybelle, well, no one knew what to think about her. She was seen less and less in daylight. To an outsider, the Ozarks were peaceful that year, untouched by the rush of cities and modern life. But beneath that stillness, something was stirring. The air grew heavier. The nights stretched longer. The land itself seemed uneasy, as if holding its breath. It would be months before anyone went looking for the missing men in earnest, and by then what they found under the sisters' house would make the town wish they'd never looked at all. By early winter, the quiet peace that once covered Crawford Hollow began to unravel thread by thread. The missing men's names were now whispered over dinner tables and muttered in prayer. Yet no one could say the words out loud. The sisters. Fear lived behind half-closed curtains, in the eyes of wives who waited by windows for husbands who never came home. The Ozark sisters still smiled politely when they came to town, traded bread and eggs as if nothing in the world had changed. But something about them was shifting, something you could feel even from across the street. Clara's smile had gone thinner, Ruth's eyes colder, and Maybelle, she hardly smiled at all anymore. Tensions first started to build with small things, the kind people overlook until they're too big to ignore. Men began competing for excuses to visit the sisters' property. A broken fence here, a water barrel that needed fixing there. Even married men started volunteering to help out. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fascinating. Clara had a way of making every man feel important. She'd listen with such focus that they forgot themselves. Then there was Maybelle. Her beauty wasn't loud or painted like city girls. It was quiet, unearthly almost, the kind that drew people without them realizing why. Some said her eyes were too dark, too deep, like they were reflecting something that wasn't yours. The sisters fed that attention, though never openly. They invited men for supper, thanked them with soft laughter, and offered homemade wine that smelled faintly of herbs and berries. The men came home different, tired, dazed, muttering strange things in their sleep. One wife said her husband woke up screaming that the cellar was breathing. Another claimed her son's boots came back with dried blood along the soles, though he swore he'd only been chopping wood. It was around that time that the first real cracks began to show between the sisters themselves. The neighbors who lived nearest said they could hear shouting late at night. Clara's sharp voice cutting through the wind, followed by Ruth's low, angry muttering. Sometimes they heard something heavier, like furniture being thrown. One farmer said he saw Maybelle running barefoot through the snow one night, her dress torn, before disappearing back inside when Clara called her name. Rumors began to spread that the sisters were quarreling over the men. Some said Clara wanted control over everything, the house, the food, even who Maybelle could talk to. Others believed Ruth had been keeping secrets from them both, sneaking out at night to meet someone. But no one could prove anything, and no one dared to ask. Money was another shadow that grew over the house. The sisters had stopped coming to town as often. They no longer traded milk or eggs, and their fields looked untended. Yet somehow they always had fine clothes, lace collars, velvet ribbons, things no one in Crawford Hollow could afford. A traveling merchant once bragged in the tavern that he'd sold them jewelry, old-fashioned pieces made of bone and silver. When someone asked how they paid, he just smiled and said, "They always have something worth trading." By February, the fear in town had hardened into suspicion. The sheriff finally made the ride up to the ridge, though he came back pale and wordless. He said the sisters were strange but harmless. A few weeks later, he left town altogether, claiming a sick mother in Missouri. Some said he'd been paid off. Others whispered that he'd seen something in that house that had stolen the breath right out of him. For the sisters, the pressure from the outside world only seemed to push them closer to the edge. Clara's control grew tighter. She kept the doors locked, forbade Ruth or Maybelle from speaking to strangers. She said it was for their safety that people in town were turning against them, but Ruth knew better. Clara wasn't protecting them, she was protecting something else. Ruth started keeping a small journal hidden under the floorboards near her bed. Her handwriting was messy and uneven, but her words were sharp with fear. She wrote about voices in the cellar, about men begging to leave long after they should have been gone, about Clara telling her, "We're only doing what must be done." The last entry mentioned Maybelle crying at the edge of the trapdoor, whispering to someone below, though the words were too faint to hear. There was something about Maybelle that people couldn't explain. When she walked through town, children hid behind their mothers, yet men stared as if under a spell. Her beauty had grown almost sickly, thin and pale, as though she hadn't slept in weeks. Her wrists were bruised. Her smile trembled. Some said she wanted to leave, that she'd tried once only for Clara to drag her back by the hair. As winter dragged on, strange noises were reported near the ridge, screams, metallic clanks, and a low humming sound that carried through the trees. A hunter swore he saw men's silhouettes digging behind the sisters' house. But when he brought others to see, the ground was smooth and untouched, the air thick with the stench of iron. Inside the house, Clara's temper grew meaner. She started locking Ruth in her room for hours. Once she slapped Maybelle so hard her nose bled, then kissed her forehead and told her she had to learn obedience. Ruth began to fear her sister more than the outside world. She'd wake at night to the sound of chains dragging across the floor below, followed by Clara's voice, soft and gentle, like she was praying. It was Ruth who first tried to warn someone. She left a note under a loaf of bread she sold to a peddler, just 3 words, "Help us, please." But the peddler never returned. His horse was found days later, reins torn, its hooves caked with red mud from the ridge. Back in town, the missing count had reached 21. Panic turned into anger. Wives demanded answers, fathers gathered rifles, and men who'd once been enchanted by the sisters now spoke their names like a curse. Still, no one dared go up the ridge at night. They said the forest didn't sound right anymore, that the wind carried voices that weren't human. Meanwhile, Clara grew more distant, speaking in riddles about the gift and the chosen. She said the mountain had promised them something, that they'd been called. Ruth begged her to stop whatever she was doing, but Clara's faith had turned into madness. She spoke of building something pure, something greater than the men who mocked them. Maybelle's condition worsened. She started fainting often, her body weak and cold to the touch. Some nights, Ruth found her sitting by the cellar door, humming a tune that sounded almost like a lullaby. When asked what she was doing, she said she was listening to them breathe. By March, Ruth knew she had to escape. She packed a small bag and waited until Clara went down to the cellar with a lantern. But before she could slip out, she heard Clara whispering something through the floorboards. A man's voice answered her, hoarse, begging. Then came the sound of laughter, not Clara's, not any woman. That night the snowstorm came. It howled through the mountains like a warning. No one saw the sisters for weeks afterward. But people in Crawford Hollow began waking to find dead birds on their porches, arranged in circles. And though the roads to the ridge were blocked, someone swore they saw a flicker of light deep in the trees, steady, pulsing like a heartbeat. Inside that decaying farmhouse, Clara, Ruth, and Maybelle stood on the edge of something terrible. The lies between them had grown too heavy to hide. The men buried below their feet were no longer just ghosts. They were becoming part of whatever Clara had promised to create. And for the first time, even Ruth began to wonder if leaving would make any difference at all. By spring, the forest had gone silent again, but the silence wasn't peace, it was waiting for the moment everything would break. The night the truth came out, the wind over the Ozark screamed like something alive. It clawed through the trees, rattled the shutters, and filled every hollow space with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Inside the farmhouse, Clara moved with purpose, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. A single oil lamp burned on the table, throwing weak light across the room. The shadows bent and stretched, almost human in shape. Beneath the floorboards, something moved. The cellar had become the sisters' secret world, hidden under a false trapdoor in the kitchen. It smelled of iron and damp wood, thick with the scent of sweat and blood. The walls were carved unevenly from rock, their surfaces slick with condensation. Chains hung from the beams like vines. The men, those who were still alive, sat slumped in the corners, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Their clothes were torn, their bodies thin and shaking, some whispered prayers. Others just stared blankly ahead, past the walls, past the women who had done this to them. Clara descended the steps that night with a lantern in one hand and a long knife in the other. Ruth followed behind her, her hands trembling, her eyes wide and wet. She didn't want to be there, but Clara had insisted. "You need to see," she'd said. "You need to understand what we've built." Maybelle waited near the back wall, her skin ghostly pale, her hair hanging in tangled ropes. She stopped eating days ago. She no longer spoke much except when she hummed that strange, low tune that made even Clara uneasy. Now she watched silently as her sister walked toward the center of the cellar where a man was chained to a post, his head drooping, his lips split from cold and thirst. He tried to lift his gaze, but his strength had long been drained away. Clara crouched beside him, touching his face like she was comforting a child. "You're part of something pure," she whispered. "You should be proud." Her voice shook slightly as she said it. For a moment, something human flickered in her expression, fear or maybe regret. Then she pressed the blade to his neck. Ruth flinched. "Clara, please no more," she whispered. Clara didn't answer. Her face was blank, her eyes distant. It was as if she couldn't hear her sister at all. The knife moved. The man gasped once, his breath cutting short, and then silence. Only the sound of dripping followed, a steady rhythm that mixed with the wind howling above. Maybelle turned away, pressing her hands to her ears. "You said it was supposed to stop," she said softly. "You promised me it would stop." Clara stood, wiping the blade with a cloth. "It will," she said. "When it's done, when we finish what we started." Ruth backed away until her shoulders hit the cold wall. She'd known Clara had gone too far, but seeing it, hearing the way the man's breath had stopped, something broke inside her. She thought of all the faces she'd seen come and never return, of the faint cries she'd tried to ignore. And now she realized it wasn't just madness driving Clara, it was belief. Clara truly thought this was holy work. The cellar grew quieter except for the faint sobs from the other men. Clara turned to them, her voice calm but heavy with command. "Each of you will serve your purpose. The mountain called you here, don't fight it." Her words echoed in the dark, twisting into something cold. That's when Ruth snapped. She lunged forward, grabbing Clara's arm. "No more," she hissed. "We're finished. This is God's work, it's yours, it's all you." For the first time, Clara's mask cracked. She stared at her sister like she'd never seen her before. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "You've never understood. You think I wanted this?" She pointed at the blood pooling at her feet. "You think I enjoy this? We did what we had to. We were nothing before this house. Nothing. Now the world will remember us." Maybelle began to cry softly. "Clara, please," she whispered. "Let them go, please." But Clara only shook her head. "They're already gone." Ruth pushed past her, reaching for the keys hanging on the wall. Before she could grab them, Clara struck her hard across the face. Ruth fell against the dirt floor, dazed. Clara knelt beside her, her voice breaking into a whisper. "You think you can save them? You can't even save yourself." Ruth's hand brushed against the lantern that had fallen during the struggle. The glass cracked, spilling oil across the ground. The smell of it hit the air like a warning. Clara didn't notice. She reached for the knife again, raising it. But Maybelle screamed, a sound so raw it tore through the air like thunder. "Stop!" she cried, lunging between them. Her hands gripped Clara's wrist, shaking. For a moment they struggled, sister against sister, the knife glinting between them. The lantern flame caught the spilled oil. Fire bloomed across the floor. The men in chains screamed as the heat surged upward. The smoke was thick, filling every corner, turning the air into a choking fog. Clara tried to smother the flames, but they spread too fast. Ruth scrambled to her feet, coughing, her vision blurred. She saw Clara dragging Maybelle toward the stairs, shouting at her to move. But Maybelle resisted, pulling away, her eyes wild. "I hear them," she cried. "They're still down there." The fire roared louder, swallowing her words. Ruth ran for the door, but the smoke was blinding. She could barely breathe. She stumbled, found the keys, and with shaking hands tried to unlock the chains. One of the men grabbed her arm, begging her to hurry. But the metal was too hot, the locks rusted and swollen. The fire reached the ceiling beams. Clara turned back one last time, her face lit by orange light. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "If this is how it ends, then we end together." Ruth looked at her sister, her beautiful, broken sister, and something inside her hardened. "You did this," she said. "Not the mountain, not God, you." The ceiling cracked. Flames rained down. Ruth grabbed Maybelle's wrist and pulled her toward the stairs. Clara tried to follow, but the wooden steps collapsed beneath her. For a heartbeat, Ruth saw her face through the smoke, eyes wide, mouth open, not in fear, but in something like peace. Then she was gone. Ruth and Maybelle burst out of the house into the freezing night. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, hissing as they met the fire. Behind them, the farmhouse burned bright enough to turn the trees red. The screams from below faded into the crackle of burning wood. Ruth dragged her sister into the woods, both of them shaking, coughing, covered in soot. They collapsed near a stream, their lungs burning, their ears filled with the distant roar of the flames. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire lit up the night like sunrise, and Ruth realized there would be no going back, not for either of them. Maybelle stared at the fire, her face blank. "They'll find us," she whispered. Ruth shook her head. "No, we'll keep walking," but her voice was hollow. Behind them, the sisters' house. Their prison, their altar, their crime collapsed into itself, sending a column of black smoke curling into the sky. The fire devoured everything. The chains, the cellar, the men. The mountain swallowed the screams, leaving only silence. By morning, snow had covered what was left. No footprints, no signs of life. Just a scorched ruin standing where the Ozark sisters once lived. And somewhere deep in the forest, Ruth and Maybelle kept walking, two broken shadows trying to escape a horror that would never really let them go. By morning, the fire had burned itself to ash. The snow kept falling long after the last beam gave way, smothering the blackened remains of the sisters' house. From the ridge below, the smoke looked like fog curling up from the trees. It took days before anyone dared climb the path to see what was left. And when they did, they found silence, thick, heavy silence that made every step sound too loud. The townspeople came in groups, guns and crosses in hand, expecting to find devils or bodies or both. But the cellar was nothing more than a hole filled with ice and char. The chains had melted into twisted lumps of metal. The air stank of burned flesh and iron. Some said the ground itself was cursed now, that you could still hear voices when the wind blew through the ruins. No one wanted to stay long enough to find out. For weeks, search parties combed the woods, calling out for Ruth and Maybelle. No one expected to find Clara. Everyone knew she had gone down with the fire. But the younger two people hoped they'd fled before the flames reached them. Others whispered that they'd perished too, that the forest had claimed them as punishment for what happened. When the snow thawed, they found signs, small, haunting clues. A torn piece of Maybelle's shawl caught on a thorn bush. Footprints leading down toward the stream before vanishing in the mud. And near the river bend, a wooden charm, scorched at the edges, carved with a symbol no one recognized. It wasn't a cross. It wasn't anything the church had ever taught. The town of Crawford Hollow began to rot from the inside out after that winter. People moved away. Farms went untended. The church doors stayed shut more often than not. Those who remained carried the story like a wound that wouldn't heal. The women who'd once gossiped about the sisters now crossed themselves at their names. The men who'd laughed about visiting their home kept quiet, avoiding each other's eyes. A few wives never forgave their husbands for what they suspected but could never prove. Ruth and Maybelle did survive, though no one saw them for months. They hid in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, living off roots and rainwater. Ruth's hands were blistered from the cold, her face gaunt, her eyes haunted. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Clara's face in the fire, saw the look of calm acceptance before the flames took her. The guilt came in waves. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that the fire had saved more lives than it took. But at night, when the wind howled through the trees, she could hear the men's screams again, and she wasn't so sure. Maybelle was worse. She hardly spoke at all. Some nights she'd wake screaming, clawing at her arms, crying that they were still breathing under the dirt. Ruth tried to comfort her, but Maybelle was slipping somewhere Ruth couldn't follow. She'd wander from the cabin for hours, sometimes returning with her dress torn, sometimes with strange things in her hands. Small bones, bits of metal, pieces of chain she claimed to find by the creek. When spring came, Ruth chose to go back to town. She couldn't live like that anymore, starving, hiding, waiting for ghosts. She left Maybelle sleeping by the fire and walked the miles down the mountain barefoot. By the time she reached Crawford Hollow, her feet were bleeding, her face gray with exhaustion. The few who recognized her froze in their tracks. She didn't look like the woman they remembered. She looked like a specter that had crawled out of the ashes. Ruth told the preacher everything, about the cellar, the men, the fire. She spoke in a flat, trembling voice, her words stumbling out like they'd been locked up for too long. The preacher didn't interrupt. He just stared, his hand gripping his Bible so tight his knuckles went white. When she finished, she asked if he thought God could forgive her. He didn't answer right away. He just said, "Some sins burn too deep for words." Within a day, the sheriff from the next county was called in. He questioned Ruth until her voice cracked. She led them to the ruins, showed them where the trapdoor had been. They dug for days, unearthing what was left, bones blackened and fused together, fragments of boots and buckles, a handful of teeth. They counted 28 sets in all, just like the rumors had said. The story spread quickly. Papers from as far as St. Louis printed headlines like "The Breeding Cellar of the Ozark Sisters" and "The Devil Women of Crawford Hollow." The world turned the sisters into monsters overnight. Clara was painted as the mastermind, Ruth as her accomplice, and Maybelle as the innocent corrupted by them both. People loved that version. It was easier to understand evil when it had faces. Easier still when those faces belonged to women who didn't fit the world's rules. But the truth was messier, darker. Ruth was arrested within a week. She didn't fight it. She confessed to everything, though most of it made no sense to the men writing it down. She talked about Clara's visions, about the calling, about how the mountain had demanded offerings. The sheriff asked her what that meant. She said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Maybelle never came down from the ridge. When the lawman went to the cabin, it was empty. Her footprints led to the stream and stopped. Some said she drowned herself. Others believed she'd gone deeper into the forest, where no one dared follow. Years later, hunters still claimed to see her wandering near the ruins, barefoot, her hair white as snow, humming that same tune. Ruth's trial was brief. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with people who wanted to see the last of the Ozark sisters punished. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't even defend herself. When the judge asked if she regretted it, she said, "I regret not stopping her sooner." She was sentenced to hang, but on the morning it was set to happen, the warden found her dead in her cell. She used a piece of her bedsheet to hang herself. After that, Crawford Hollow was never the same. The house on the ridge became a place people avoided. The forest grew thick around it, swallowing what little remained. The ground there never grew flowers again. Locals said the birds wouldn't even sing near it. But every few winters, when the snow fell just right, travelers passing through claimed to see a faint light flickering among the trees, like a lantern swinging slowly, waiting for someone to come home. The town carried the weight of that story for generations. Some said it was a warning about pride, about sin, about women who lived outside the law of men. Others saw it differently, as a story of madness born from isolation, from fear, from a life too hard and too lonely to bear. Whatever truth lived beneath it, all was buried with the sisters. And though time softened the details, the legend never truly died. Parents told their children not to wander into the woods after dark. Hunters still left offerings, bread, salt, a silver coin at the edge of Devil's Hollow, just in case. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the mountains, people swore they could still hear faint laughter rising from the ridge, echoing through the trees, like the ghosts of the sisters reminding the living that the dead never really stay buried. When the Ozark sisters were finally arrested in the early winter of 1901, no grand showdown or gunfire was echoing through the hills. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Sheriff Amos Dunn walked them out of the cellar in handcuffs, their faces pale and hollow under the morning sun. The once mysterious sisters of the mountains were now nothing more than two women with dirt under their fingernails and blood dried into the seams of their dresses. The silence that followed their capture was heavier than the crimes themselves, as if the entire Ozark Valley was holding its breath, unsure how to react to the truth it had been living beside for years. The trial that followed stretched for months, and the townspeople came from miles around just to catch a glimpse of them. Reporters from as far as St. Louis filled the courthouse pews, scribbling down every grim detail as it surfaced. The sisters, Clara and Etta, didn't cry, didn't speak much, and rarely looked up. Their defense claimed madness brought on by isolation and superstition. The prosecution said it was greed and lust for control. The truth, as it often is, lay somewhere murky in between. What started as a story of survival and self-preservation had warped into something unspeakable. The remains of 28 men were eventually unearthed from the cellar and surrounding fields. Some skeletons were found bound, others lying face down in shallow graves. The coroner noted strange marks on the bones, signs of restraint, possibly experiments. It became clear the men had not just vanished. They had been taken, used, and discarded. The story shocked the nation. People wanted answers that would make sense of it all, but no one could explain why two women had done what they did, or how so many men could disappear without anyone noticing until it was far too late. In the weeks after their conviction, the sisters were sent to an asylum rather than a prison. The judge said they were not of sound mind, though many whispered that it was only because he didn't have the stomach to see women hanged. Clara died first, less than a year after arriving, found in her room, her throat slit with a piece of glass. Etta lived on for another decade, spending her final years talking to no one except the shadows she claimed were her children. When she passed, no one came to collect her body. She was buried in an unmarked grave behind the asylum, her name never carved into stone. Valley of Black Hollow, where the farmhouse stood, changed after that. The land was bought and sold several times, each new owner trying to erase the memory of what had happened there. But the place never felt right again. Locals said you could still hear whispers from the cellar on cold nights, low, pleading voices asking to be let go. Children dared each other to go near it, though most wouldn't. The few who did swore they saw candlelight flickering under the dirt, as if the ground itself hadn't yet forgotten. The case of the Ozark sisters became one of those stories people retold around campfires or at taverns, half warning, half fascination. Some said they represented the dangers of isolation, how madness can grow when cut off from the world. Others thought they were victims of their own time, women pushed to extremes in a world that gave them no power except what they could seize for themselves. But those who had known them before the killings, those who remembered their soft smiles and quiet generosity, refused to accept that explanation. They believed something darker had taken root in those women, something ancient and hungry that used their pain as a doorway. The authorities burned the house down in 1905 after a second investigation revealed more remains under the barn. It was supposed to bring closure, but instead it deepened the legend. The soil turned black and refused to grow crops for decades. Locals called it the cursed patch, and many still avoid it. Even now, some believe the sisters' evil wasn't entirely their own, that something in the mountains had whispered to them, promising life in exchange for death. In the end, justice came only in a technical sense. The sisters were caught. The killings stopped. But justice in the moral sense, real human justice, was harder to find. 28 families never saw their sons, brothers, or husbands again. Their bones were buried quietly without names because there was no way to know which was which. The families tried to move on, but the loss that deep never truly heals. It simply settles in the soul, heavy and quiet like the air before a storm. Looking back now, more than a century later, the case stands as a grim mirror of the human heart. It forces us to ask the questions we'd rather not. What happens when loneliness turns into hunger? When grief turns into control? And when people stop seeing others as human and start seeing them as tools for survival? The Ozark sisters may have been monsters in the end, but they were not born that way. They were shaped by isolation, by loss, by a world that looked away for too long. Their story isn't just about what happened in that cellar. It's about the quiet decay that starts long before the first act of violence. The kind that begins in the heart, grows in the shadows, and waits for the moment when no one is watching. That's where evil lives, not in the cellar, not in the bones, but in the silence that lets it happen. And so the legend remains, buried somewhere between history and horror. A reminder that monsters are rarely born. They're made, one choice at a time, in the dark corners of the human soul.